Please welcome to the stage Dr. Edda Aradottir, Adrian Corless, Julie Gosalvez, and Robinson Meyer for a panel on DAC project essentials, securing buyers, investors, and sites.
Thanks so much. Thank you for joining us. Let's just start by having us go down the panel. And it's funny, first of all, I love the panel name because as far as I can tell, buyers, investors, and sites is like 95% of the business. I keep wanting to be corrected here, but it seems like a large share of what dominates a balance sheet. So we're going to talk about as much as we can of it today. Let's start by going down and just, if you can share, I think we're all familiar with your titles, but if you can share where your firm and kind of your own role sits in the direct air capture value chain, so to speak.
Okay, great. Thanks for inviting me speaking here. So I'm the CMO at Climeworks, and Climeworks is a leader in direct air capture, moving as fast as possible into the deployment, right? Bringing direct air capture and storage to life, along with our partner Carbfix here in Iceland first, with the first of a kind plant open in 2021, and now in application and negotiation rounds for TA3 in the US and exploring as well other locations. So that's why this topic is very relevant. So it's all about deploying and bringing large-scale DAC as fast as possible.
Sure. So thanks. I'm Adrian Corless. I'm CEO and CTO of Carbon Capture Inc., Los Angeles-based direct air capture company. I would say just in terms of kind of how I would characterize ourselves, so first and foremost, we're a technology company that's made some decisions around being very material science forward. So we've approached the industry understanding that, in our opinion, science and particular material science is going to actually be the engine for cost reduction over time. So we have an open architecture. We have about a dozen or so unique development programs with universities and corporate labs, et cetera. But that's kind of like us as a technology company. We also realized that in the early days of deployment, in terms of, I would say the immaturity of the project development players in the space, there aren't any, that we need to take an outsized role off our balance sheet in terms of standing up projects. So in that, and also, we also have the advantage being in the US and having access to the 45Q and hopefully in the future the DAC hubs as support of early projects. It's certainly a decade in front of us where the development of projects has the ability to basically give more venture-like returns. So I think we are also looking forward to participating through this next decade, taking advantage of the US situation to hopefully get to a scale where post 2032 we can be looking at something that's a little more conventional in terms of how technology is deployed and developed.
Yes, thank you. I'm Edda. I'm with Carbfix. So we're a slightly different company. So we take the CO2 that these good people and other people in the room plan on capturing from the atmosphere, and we inject it into the subsurface, into specific rock formations where it mineralizes permanently through natural processes. And I'm like 5-year-old kids. I always carry rocks in my pockets. So this is what the CO2 turns into through our process. So yeah, that's what we do. We've been developing the technology since, ages ago. It started in 2006. First, predominantly with point source capture and storage in mind. So we'd already sort of demonstrated that process when we met our good friends in Climeworks in 2016. But since then, also been very actively working within the direct air capture and storage space.
Can we start just by, when you're putting a site together or a project together, what comes first? Like, what needs to come first? What is the kind of 0 to 1 where you're like, okay, there's nothing here. Okay, now we're starting to put a project together here.
Well, I think you can say you need storage if that is the angle that you're pursuing. If you want to do direct air capture and storage, you have to make sure that you have the possibility for that in a certain location. Having said that, it's not that simple. I mean, we wouldn't go out and develop a site without having at least some knowledge that we would have a potential buyer, wanting to provide us with CO2 at that location. You might do desktop studies, but anything beyond that, you already have to have some sort of early stage relationship. And that's really then how the process moves ahead as you develop projects. You have to develop the various angles of the value chain in parallel, and it's not an easy task.
Yeah, no, it definitely starts with site, right? Because, as we also focus on high quality permanent storage underground, this is the thing you can't move, right? Or you can't add to the site. So that's really the first requirement. But that site also needs to comply with renewable energy capacity, right? Being already available or being able to be built. That's really the two component that we're looking at. And some of it, will be sequential, but a lot of it will be also in parallel on one location, but also in multiple location, right? So it's really this puzzle that's starting around, and I think we'll talk more about that. But that's really important to know that there are different streams going on in parallel. But that's probably the first one.
I think this is the what I'm trying to understand. I think most broadly is kind of what is the when you start thinking through putting a project together, that site has to come first. But then, do you also have kind of an offtake client in mind? Do you have investors in mind? Just like, what is the sequencing there? So maybe you start out with storage, you start out with geological capability. What comes next after that?
Sure. I mean, I also would say that, when we're looking at a modular system and not wanting to go and take sort of a $1 billion first bite in terms of capital risk, there are certain things, even in terms of the project partners on sequestration we're looking for. And so I think, what we're seeing is, a small handful of companies that are standing up carbon management businesses. A lot of them, I think, are doing this with an eye towards point source capture as the anchor tenants, at least for now. So I think that the degree to which we can leverage infrastructure on site is really important. So we've found for sure, if you're thinking about a greenfield site and you're looking at trying to develop a DAC-only solution, and the hurdles in terms of having the capacity large enough to start a Class 6 wells operation, and also the cost of bringing in fresh infrastructure if it's a greenfield site, those are really big chunks. So I think the degree to which our sequestration partners are leveraging point source emitters, and that we may be in an industrial site where for whatever developmental or economic developmental reasons there's land set aside and power and infrastructure, I think we're seeing those as being some of the easier sort of first bites of a project.
No, I think definitely, right? One thing is the suitability of the site on its own, and then it's what revolves around that increases the likelihood that actually it becomes a DAC site, right? And as you rightly pointed out, we're not at a stage yet where, direct air capture only would justify investment, for infrastructure for geological storage on its own, or even likely, some additional renewable energy investment, right? So we're also dependent on whatever the ecosystem around is in terms of either gathering forces with other players or upgrading or adjusting whatever on the ground from that side.
And then once you have a site kind of in mind, do you then have investors who you've maybe been queuing, or investors who you then, offtake agreements who you've been thinking about? Like, I perhaps this question is a little premature for the industry, given that there's is there more siting capacity than we have to set up DAC right now? But I think I'm just trying to understand how this puzzle comes together. Once you have the site, who do you talk to next?
Well, once you have a site, you have to characterize it thoroughly. So it's not just enough to say, okay, I have the site, I know we have good formations. You have to understand, what is the porosity, what is the permeability, where is the groundwater table, how would you drill below that, how are you going to case the wells to make sure that you protect the surface groundwaters. So it's not enough just to have a site. That's when you start exploring the subsurface and sort of coming up with a proper reservoir management plan. That takes time. This feeds into rigorous permitting processes. Of course, while you're doing that, yes, it's it's good to start thinking about, which investors can you bring on board and pursue offtakes. But you will not have a final investment decision until you finalized more or less the permitting process. And that's really one of the big struggles in my mind in the space now. We have a standardized approach on how to characterize the subsurface. Yes, you might have different properties, in different parts of the world, but we go about it in a standardized way. But these human-made systems for how you secure permitting, those are not uniform. They are extremely complex, when you compare it, how is it in Europe, how is it in US, how is it in the global south? And that is really a big issue that we're struggling with. So, and that's something you have to figure out before you pursue the investors, because they want to know, how are you going to make sure you can build it?
So let's stand on permitting for a second. You're unusual in that you're unusual in this room in that we're having a whole conversation about permitting in the United States, around the DAC hubs, around kind of energy and renewable infrastructure in general. You have a lot of familiarity with how it works in Europe. So can you just compare what the US and European processes are like for us? Julie, I'm going to invite you to come in too if you'd like.
Well, I would want to be compared, completely, but honestly, I don't have a full understanding of exactly how it's done in the US, but it's different than in Europe. What we have in Europe is, it's a rigorous process. We've done it, so I know the ins and outs of it. But there it's uniform across the countries in Europe that allow storage. When it comes to the US, it's completely different. And then, state by state, it varies somewhat. But I would say, it's as long as you can get guidance and have local partners that work with you on how do you secure permit in this jurisdiction and the other, that's fine. But it takes too long. And that's something that we have to, as a community, the policymakers really have to increase the efficiency there. But one theme that worries me, and that's we have the same in Europe, is that the existing frameworks and the policies, they're designed for specific technology, and they have to become technology neutral. Not just because we have a new and emerging storage technology, but with all the research and innovation that's ongoing, I think we can safely say we're going to make tremendous progress in the coming years. And we have to make sure that the regulatory framework is ready for that and not too rigorous on exactly you have to do things based on state of the art as it is today.
Is there any equivalent? In the US, there's a lot of energy devoted right now to actually exactly what the last panel was about, which is making sure there's community benefits, making sure that the whoever is near a project isn't going to be hurt by it, that there's not going to be unjust outcomes. There's a lot of different kind of ways of judging that. Is there an equivalent framework in Europe, or is that more part of the kind of general streamlining?
It's sort of included in the environmental impact assessment. It's a public consultation process, but of course you have to make sure that you engage with the communities. We have exactly the same, situation there. You have to ensure you have social license to operate. I would say we've done it quite well in Iceland, where where we've been operating our systems for more than 10 years now. However, the culture aspect is so different. So I think it's extremely important that you also have to have a local partner to guide you through what is the messaging that works here as opposed to in other locations.
Adrian, you've been quiet for a bit, so can you just walk us through how you think about this permitting? And then also kind of lining up the capital stack, lining up offtake. What does that puzzle look like in the American perspective?
Yeah, from our perspective specifically, when we're talking about Wyoming or we're engaging in others projects, again, we're piggybacking on to a company like Edda that's doing carbon management as a business. So I think we're cheerleaders, but we're not leading the permitting side of sequestration. If we're talking about Wyoming, we're working with the DEQ on permitting our facilities, and of course that's on us. But I think that I think that that's a shorter putt than obviously the geological permitting side of this. But again, kind of as you're evolving, as you're putting your pieces together, you've identified your partners on the storage side. Our experience so far, and we've pre-sold project credits that we've announced to Microsoft and BCG, and we have a few others that we'll be able to talk about shortly. they need a project. I mean, these need to be attached to a project that you can do an LCA on, that you can actually give a coherent energy strategy around. And so I think, again, that's something that sales cycle kind of starts when you at least have the framework of the project, and then you do it in parallel. I think on the capital side, that's really tough, right? Because I think, right now, we're looking at doing the initial stages of development off balance sheet. So that's us using, pretty expensive equity to do the early stages of project development. And, we certainly expect that projects will all be their own entities stood up with a variety of different equity holders and bringing in debt. But that's going to happen at a certain level of de-risking that we're not at yet. And so I think, to me, I suspect, and what we're seeing even in the funding round we're doing now, is that we're kind of entering the realms where strategics become super important in terms of some of those early projects and where that capital might come from.
Do you have a sense of where we are? Let's put ourselves in the solar PPA framework. What year is it for solar?
I don't know, whatever it is, like minus 10 years at least, right? I think that, when we talk about us having kind of a business environment where, we can just be an OEM and provide equipment and services into a project developer, I think that's post 2032, post 45Q's, sort of support of this. I think it's at a point at which, we've driven as an industry the volumes and the knowledge to the point which this can kind of support a compliance-like market at $200-ish a ton. And I think that's out decade plus.
What's the one thing from policy that you would need? And we can go US or European policy, depending on whichever one you would like most. But what's the one missing piece from the policy landscape right now?
Well, I think it's more than one piece, but it has to be more efficient, tech neutral. I would say those are the critical aspects. And the more we can move to a more uniform global approach, it may be naive to even ask for that, but the more efficiently we can build to scale, because it's a global problem. And when we look at direct air capture and storage, I mean, it's the same atmospheric reservoir that we're drawing the CO2 from, wherever the machinery is positioned.
And I mean, I feel in a way a bit ungrateful to ask for more, especially sitting here in the US and knowing all the steps that have been taken in the last months, right? Be it on a procurement side or on a support side for funding. There is one thing, and we need more and more and more. But there is one thing that also will catalyze that towards really high quality, is really the standards, right? Either by the criteria that a government like the U.S. administration sets, or also likewise in the U.S., all the criteria that are being set for this is what a good carbon removal and direct air capture and storage credit looks like. I think that will help driving the innovation toward where it needs to be in terms of permanence, in terms of value and associated price.
Would that matter more on the investor side or the offtake side? Like, are you finding that offtake buyers need that security as well?
Not yet. I think some very sophisticated buyers, right, that do have the knowledge and the capacity in-house to assess that, really look at that more clearly. But we do have a whole lot of buyers that are entering the market with a lot of willingness, and we're willing to learn and willing to spend, but not yet there. I think what at the moment the buyers and investors alike are really sensitive to is de-risking that you were mentioning before. And this is where we've seen a lot of added value by having Orca, the first of a kind in Iceland, because that really enables you to do the LCA, right? That's site-specific, but also validate kind of your technology. That enables you to do a methodology for, standardization and certification that didn't exist before, because that's such a new industry. Then it enables you to, sell verified, and then, soon enough, we're working on certified, and the first certified direct air capture and storage removal credits, right? So all that really brings the confidence and accelerates, through the deployment, accelerates your learning curve into getting the cost down, getting the supply chain less fragmented, and the security. And that's what investors require, right? Because I find that while there is some experience in the wind and solar industry with larger infrastructure spending required, it's still a bit of a headache sometimes, right, for some investor when looking at the absolute amount that are required to build some plants, and that's project finance, but also equity, and the level of maturity or the desired level of maturity that the technology can demonstrate. At the moment, right? There's a lot of optimization going on. So that's a whole like virtuous circle that needs to be triggered, but it takes some time and education and also courageous stepping in from investors and buyers.
If I can add, I think in addition to it being important to the stakeholder that Julie mentioned, I think when we look at the local communities around where we are actually operating the systems, to have a framework in place that makes sure that certain data is gathered and that it's transparent so that it can be that much clearer what is the ultimate climate benefit. That's going to be an extremely important factor to maintain social license to operate. This is what we've experienced throughout our development journey. Carbfix started as a pure R&D project, so from the very beginning we've been very open with the scientific data, transparent, publish peer-reviewed papers, and that has been tremendously helpful in not just gathering, and making sure that we demonstrating and but also maintaining the social license to operate, to have the scientific literature sort of backing up what we are saying.
And also the questions, right, from the community, as you said, sometimes with the question, are those big fans really noisy, right? And, is that going to be, but I mean, you can imagine that no one who's been, someone who's never been on site sees this big machine and understand, how much of a disturbance is going to be, or, is it dangerous for bird life, right? So having been able to collect the data, what's the noise level, what's the bird life, and also, I'm inviting anyone who, would want to come to Orca, and I'm sure Edda welcomes them as well at Carbfix to come and see, what it looks like.
Right? You mentioned de-risking, and I think normally de-risking kind of means financial risk, but you're really talking about almost every kind of uncertainty related to the project. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's encompasses beyond finance. Finance is the name of the game at the moment, right? We need the capital to be able to deploy, and that takes different form. Equity, project finance, offtake, and they're kind of all interrelated. The more security you can give, the longer term, the bigger the offtake, right? The more you'll get the equity investor and the project finance willing to step in. But there are plenty of other risks, right? That at the moment, might not be proven, but might be perceived. And that's where the deployment really leads the way into offsetting those.
I want to talk about the private market in a second, but Adrian, I think you skipped I think you've so far evaded this question.
No,
what's the one policy ask that you would have?
Well, I think there's a couple. I'll go through them real quick. So I think first of all, I think that when we look at a transition ultimately from a voluntary market willing to pay a premium because we're dealing with emissions of high margin businesses, but that's kind of shallow pool. And ultimately thinking about in the long term this becoming more of a compliance market where ultimately it's sort of baked into policy and regulations. I think there's a place in between, probably in terms of price per ton, where we probably need to see procurement being, and the government playing a role there. So I think that's one.
And the existing DOE procurement. I mean, obviously it's a very early stage.
I mean, right now, you could look at the 45Q as some ways as a guaranteed offtake, which doesn't retire the actual environmental attribute of the credit, but it's there, and that's really important. But I think for our industry, the reality is that we need that stack of subsidy and credit purchase to make the industry work to start. And I think there's going to be potentially a bit of a valley of death issue when we get to where we're looking at millions of tons and the demand curve probably doesn't support the kinds of prices that are being paid today. So I think that's where I think there's a potential role there to basically set a floor on the price of a engineered carbon removal credit.
And what year is that valley of death? Is this a 2032 issue? I mean, is this when 45Q expires?
It could be something that replaces 45Q, or it could be like solar and wind credits that just keep on getting extended depending on the needs. So so maybe again there's another way that plays out. I think another one that's kind of important is that the DAC hubs are great, and I think we've got 2 Topic Area 2 awards, which provide $12.5 million each for feed studies in particular projects, but there's still nothing there for capital for the projects themselves. And I think if you're Climeworks and you have a TA3, which is awesome, you have line of sight to significant non-dilutive support for the project itself. So there's that's sort of in the range of 200,000 tons or greater. there is sort of nothing between, I think, funding that's at sort of university level lab scale prototyping and that. And I think that, there's been a discussion around pilot plant awards, but again, it's a competition, it's kind of clunky. So I think, the funding for a 4,000 to 50,000 ton plant to get more of those going, I think that mechanism needs to be there, or support could be there.
That's really interesting, because I feel like that university lab, you're 10 years out from commercialization, is the classic valley of death, right? So is right now all of the funding there coming from balance sheet? I mean, is that all equity financing that's
From
happening?
our perspective, yeah.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we do have, right now we have currently one active DOE program, which is more a siting study on co-location to use waste heat, but that's not, like, all of the things we're doing from a fundamentals point of view and a product and technology point of view is off balance sheet.
Maybe just to come back to your point earlier, like, what's the sequence, right? Sometime it's again, all about risk, right? You might want to move forward on your own equity, and you need to have some solid backup to do that. And once the project is FID, then go back to project finance or refinancing, right? Because you have, in the meantime, proven some offtake, but then you need to have the foundation to be able to do that. And that's a lot to ask to be doing that for many players in the industry, as many as we need to meet the climate target, and as many as we need to make sure that then the funnel leads to the right company emerging with the right volumes.
What do you need from the private sector? I mean, I think we were just touching on this, but obviously some of that kind of 10 years out, that like classic valley of death financing could conceivably come from a non-dilutive, like strategic investor. What the private sector market for DAC right now is obviously, I would describe it as highly eccentric compared to other markets, but how does it need to progress further to get us kind of to this reality now where there are DAC hubs, there is 45Q on the books, but maybe, I don't know, maybe the markets, the offtake market isn't as deep as it could be. The investors aren't trained enough yet. Like, on the path to bankability, what do we need?
Yeah, I think you're right on a few of those points. So I think that in terms of the education in general of the communities that are used to doing renewables projects, we're still really, really in the early days. And so I think that in the context of what we'll be looking at over the next 3 to 4 years, hopefully, again, we've been reasonably successful in being able to raise enough equity into the organization to be able to get these things started. Our current funding round is characterized largely by strategics that are also, I think, aligned, whether it's on project support or project financing or offtake. I think we're seeing more of that as well too. So I think it's getting alignment within our shareholder base to support what we need to do next.
I mean, how do you even have a conversation with someone who is like, well, this facility or this project or this technology will be profitable, we expect, in 20 or 30 years? Is that really only strategics who can play a role?
Well, I hope it's not that long.
Okay.
I mean,
how long do you think? Yeah.
I mean, I think for us, I think that the challenge is going to be to get through these early stages of deployment, getting up to that 100,000 plus level of deployment where you can start to become a little more efficient with your capital and the infrastructure. And again, the challenge with these projects, again, is that there's, on the one hand, having a modular system is great, and we can go and take bite-sized chunks of the problem. But on the other hand, it has this issue of, unless you've got a partner that's got infrastructure sitting on a facility ready to use, it's really cost prohibitive to start and be just on your own going out to start these projects. So I think the strategics, are also likely going to offer us a bunch of different situational opportunities in terms of starting out a little bit smaller and potentially helping to start to solve some of their problems.
How do you think about this as I think you were talking about, by the end of this decade, by the early part of next decade, as the tax credits start to roll off, establishing a large compliance market. But carbon removal is one of these things that it's a waste management service, right? So at the end of when this is a mature market, do you imagine that most of the buyers will be governments, or do you imagine they will be mostly firms?
Government. I mean, given the magnitude of the challenge and the nature of the business, as you said, I think at least at Climeworks, and I think we're convinced this is very close to a waste management system. So the private market now, be it on the offtake side or the investor side, really act as the leverage, right, to get started and to get to the scale where we need to be with, it's really led by the private sector, also including the companies that are sitting here, but enabled by great government support like we see in the US. But clearly what we need, to your question, is like this step that we see now, if the exponential growth.
I think this
right?
is that there are strategics who are operating here, and they're kind of they're being very nice to everyone by participating. But eventually, this should be a public waste management business. So, when does that transition happen? Is it as that demand starts to kind of fall off at hundreds of millions of tons, or?
I think some people in the room might be better placed to answer that question, but we can give it a go.
Well, I mean, as you're thinking about financing, kind of, maybe it doesn't matter for the projects you're working on right now.
I think, it's going to be a mix. We're going to have, the private sector being part of it as well. But obviously, if we're going to go to the volumes that we need to reach, the governments will have to step it in. But I would say, same as Julie, it's up to others than us to answer that. But obviously, the sooner the better, because then we're that more likely to be going to the scale needed.
And now a few things, on top of the funding that the governments can do in terms of incentivizing or even like pushing to action, right? The corporation, even before buying themselves, right? So that's what we're all hoping for.
Can you talk a little bit about what it's been like in the TA3 process? Are you just like, what kind of, has that really started to ramp up yet? Are there certain kinds of support that you kind of expect to be coming online soon?
Well, yes and no, right? Because at the moment, we're in between the notification of selection and the award phase, so that much I will be able to comment. I think it's a very collaborative process, understanding how to bring to life, such large infrastructure project, in general, combined with the expertise of the director capture process, and making sure that lines up properly also when it comes to the different phase of funding and, taxpayer money, and that's done at best. But we'll know more.
Adrian, backstage, we were talking about the pore space gold rush that's kind of happening right now. So I wonder, can you share how you're thinking about even approaching the kind of pore space market or handling the pore space market as carbon capturing?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing again, and the U.S. has a particular approach where the pore space itself is actually attached to the surface ownership of the land, as opposed to it being a mineral right, which may have different owners. So, again, it's not really our business, but we're certainly really well aware of that, and the project partners that are out there being serious in terms of setting up project management businesses in the U.S. are putting their land assemblies together, right? And I think so. A big part of that is I think. It's a certain skill set, and it's very akin to oil and gas in terms of and I think a lot of the energy companies are the ones out there right now securing that pore space.
Do you what's the mature version of this market? Because I think when we talk about carbon management, we often find ourselves being like, oh, oil and gas companies have expertise here, but of course the involvement of oil and gas companies is quite controversial and affects the social license to operate quite significantly. So what does a mature version of this market look like, and what is the role of oil and gas companies as you're thinking about in it?
Well, I think that there's no question that they're going to play a pretty significant role in carbon management in general. I know that it's kind of the two sides of how DAC is being considered and deployed is part of the reason also why in the U.S. it has pretty broad bipartisan support, and because it is very easy to think about how it does support the existing industries, but also deals with with climate as well. But I think from our perspective, I think that we're again kind of taking a bit of a middle of the road approach here. We're certainly not trying to say we won't partner, particularly the project side, with energy companies, again, because what we're seeing happening on the carbon management side, it is largely projects that are being developed either in conjunction with energy companies, or certainly within the same investor groups that would be supporting energy projects.
Mm-hmm. Julie, I think Climeworks has a different approach, or at least is in on its DACA project is, I believe, not involve fossil fuel companies. So
Well, I mean, building on what you said, I think it's not controversial to say, right, that skill, expertise, and experience from the oil and gas sector will be beneficial to the industry. I don't think anyone has an issue with that. I think the current, topics that I see around, also massively in the US with a European lens, is the usage of CDR by that sector, right? Which is a bit of a mirror perspective, right? And you know, as every technology and every you know, new system put in place, it needs to be, you know, carefully, you know, have a careful framework. But as soon as we say, you know, that the majority of the volumes at some point will be guardrailed and coming from governments, then you also have solved part of your topic, right? Because that's what it will be coming from. So at the moment, I think that was also clear from the, you know, the DOE guidelines, and that the application, there is no permeability between the application and the processes and EOR, right? If just to say a big word, in that room, so that the lines are being clear cut, and that's the framework we're operating happily within.
I think it's very clear that we're going to have to use the expertise, you know, from the energy sector, but it's not just oil and gas. I mean, we come from geothermal, so you know, whatever, you know, technology and operator is out there that's used to dealing with the subsurface, you know, we need those, of course, on board, but we have to do it. We have to do it right, and we have to do it responsibly.
We're going to go to questions in a second, so start thinking about your question. As with a reminder, a question is a sentence that ends in a question mark. It's what we're seeing in other parts of the climate space right now is that cost inflation and supply chain challenges have become, you know, increasingly large constraints for companies. Obviously, offshore wind is the main example. Offshore wind is a more mature business than direct air capture, but how are you thinking about it playing into your decisions, especially, I think, with, you know, potential offtake buyers where you might make commitments today or sign contracts today or make promises today that given the power prices in 2026 or the materials prices in 2026 could be really different. How are you thinking about that? I'm going to toss that first to Adrian, but yeah.
No, it's a big issue, and I think that right now we're not seeing indexing in the deals we're doing, so we're taking that risk.
Yeah.
I would say too, you know, I think in terms of how we're thinking about building out our organization and where we play in manufacturing as well too. I mean, we've made a decision that we'll stand up facilities to do at least assembly and to be able to develop a supply chain around that to try to, as much as we can, manage, you know, some of the supply chain risks as we grow. But again, over the next couple of years, we're not talking about the scale that's going to be problematic.
Can I ask one more question, which is when you think about the 45Q credit, is that cushion for you? I mean, is that bringing down the cost of a potential deal with a client on a per ton basis, or is that more just kind of giving you essentially like more operating capital?
Well, I think right now I think it's necessary. I think it's providing, you know, I mean, as evidenced by the fact that, you know, that the projects are being done in the U.S. because that's where the economics work.
Yeah.
Because you have that combination of the underlying 45Q subsidy basically, and then the ability to still sell that credit. And I think absent that right now, it's even with the prices that some of the early buyers will pay, it would be hard to define a profitable long-term project.
Got it. So that is bringing more offtake clients in. It's
basically an unlimited, you know, 12-year offtake at a pretty significant price that just sets the baseline of I would say, you know, a financeable project.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think the costs are the costs, right? So what it brings is really the willingness, you know, for buyers to pay what's the premium of the early deployment stage, and that's, you know, massively needed.
Have you seen that as much in Iceland as you've seen it, as it has been a factor in the U.S., or does the like power price security in Iceland kind of protect you somewhat from that?
I think it's very different dynamics, right? And very different stages of projects, so that's a bit hard to compare.
Cool. Let's go to questions. There's a mic runner, and I'm just going to leave it entirely in his capable hands.
Hi, my name is Nick Shu. I'm with a DAC startup called Clean Capture Tech. I just want to clarify a comment that Adrian made. This is when you're comparing to solar and talking about OEM versus operator model. So there are DAC companies like Global Thermostat, for instance, where their stated business model is we want to partner with an operator. And that makes a lot of sense to us too, because we're a small team, so that would be really attractive to us. So is in your view in the medium term, are those operating partners out there? And I guess another comparison I would draw is if we look at like carbon engineering and Oxy, putting aside the exact mechanics of that deal, if we think of Oxy as sort of the operator, in that case, is there like another Oxy out there? Maybe it's even a smaller oil company like a mid-cap operator or something like that.
So I think the answer is, there probably are going to be others that are willing to be early operators and take some of that risk on, like Oxy was for carbon engineering. So I think that that's one option. I think though that there's not that many of them out there, and I think a couple things, for us also, and we're looking to also be able to show what our business case is to our investors as well too. The nice thing about being in the project development seat, at least at this stage, is allows us also to be customer facing and to actually be sort of at the top of the revenue stack as well. So I think as an OEM, and like you mentioned Global Thermostat, I think if you are, the nice thing is if you sell something, you can, you kind of book revenue, and that's great. Projects are a lot different, a lot more complicated. But at the same time, the thing we like about our position in the market right now is that we will be the company that's able to go and be the recipient of both the 45Q and also the revenues from the voluntary market, and it's allowed us to go and show a business case for growth that's allowing us to raise capital at the parent level. So I think otherwise, you kind of have to, if you don't have a partner as you're kind of going through your capital raise process, it's going to be a little bit difficult for you to show that connectivity to where the revenues are going to be and when your customers are going to be buying.
Hi, my name is John Pope. I'm with Carbon Geocapture out of Laramie, Wyoming. We're an operator. We have a field that we're looking for DAC units for. We'll be able to start injecting, we think, by middle of next year. So if you have some units, please come talk to me.
Yeah, I'll give you a card.
Hey, Gabe Messer-Cola. I'm with EDF Renewables. This is a really informative topic because we're an IPP that's really interested in powering the DAC space in the future, or in the short term for potential co-location opportunities. I'm generally curious about, is there advocacy happening at the state level around some of these, blossoming carbon markets like Oregon, Washington, California for DAC carve-outs, similar to how we saw solar carve-outs in the Northeast bring a high premium to solar development in an area where it wasn't really previously economical, as a kind of intermediary or maybe an additional market to the private carbon market that's being formed by Frontier and other vendors?
In terms of, at the state level, there's not a lot yet. I think California, had legislation that was, that got through at least one reading last year, the Decker bill, which would have actually said if, for net emissions that you weren't able to deal with over time, you start needing to think about engineered removal. So I think we're in the really early stages of some of that potentially emerging to give a potential, state advantage to one or another. Wyoming, the governor set aside $100 million to help with cost share for projects that are being deployed in the state. So that's great. But I would say, I'm not aware of a lot more sort of state level incentives right now specific to DAC.
Hey guys, Nicholas Eisenberger, Chair of DAC Coalition and also Global Thermostat. If you were at the Climeworks event and during Climate Week, you would have heard me ask the same question, but I just want to put a fine point on it here and get your opinion. Because we've heard a couple different things about kind of how far the cost curves are out or how difficult, where the funding is going to come from for different gaps and different valleys of death. But if you look at the big picture from where we come from and where we're going to, how far out do you think sort of the commercial ecosystem is from sort of operating in a self-sustaining way? Is it 2030? Is it today? Is it 2025? We have our opinions, and I'll I'll reveal those in a second, but I'm interested in what you all think.
Not today. I think that's the easy answer.
Can I add to that? Do you think there will ever be a moment where the commercial ecosystem can operate in a self-sustaining way, or will it always involve governments as, in a procurement role or in some kind of role?
I think and hope it will. It might not come solely from cost down, but also willingness to pay more, right? And social cost of carbon, how to abate emissions, all of that will also go up. So I think our philosophy is to say that it will probably meet in the middle. It will also be tainted with what's the quality of the removal that you actually deliver in the end. I think all the prediction in terms of to come back to your question, Nick, on 2025, 2030, I think it will be only educated guess, and everyone here, it's very hard to make prediction, right? 3 years ago, we wouldn't say we would have so many people solely on DAC, right? So even if we would say 2030, maybe that ended up being 2025 or 2027. But all that we are all dedicated to that it comes as fast as possible, I think.
So I think we've got about a decade of an industry that's going to need a lot of babysitting and support. And I'm hopeful that it's the first half of 2030 that we've settled into some sort of market condition that's most likely, again, it will have to have been regular, from a regulatory point of view, created by governments, and hopefully more than just one. And hopefully at that time there, the industry's of capacity that that we can actually deploy in a more conventional way. But coming back to the earlier question, like thinking about who should be buying plants. I mean, that's another role. In terms of, I would say, infrastructure facility, the government could also just be a large buyer too, of hardware, not of credits.
I see.
I have the same answer as Adrian. It's early 2030s, approximately 10 years.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you all so much for having us.